Chapter 1.1, Line, Shape, and the Principle of Contrast. You know, of all of the elements of art that we're going to talk about in this class, line is the most, I believe, probably one of the most important artists, regardless of what genre of art you make, whether you be a sculptor, a printmaker, you know, anyone who designs compositional objects, or objects that use composition in any way, which is all art forms, go to line at the very beginning is a way to you know, get your ideas on paper, to sort of to begin to sketch, to you know, begin thinking about how to put together whatever this sort of imagined object is. And our introduction to this chapter tells us that there are elements of art, that they are the basic vocabulary of art, and that there are principles of art. And these, as we've said earlier, are how the elements of art are organized. The grammar. There is two-dimensional art, which is what we're going to primarily be talking about in this chapter, which has height and width, but not depth. And it goes on to say that lines are the most fundamental element artists use, and that lines help us to organize the visual world. This is an artwork called Spider. It is an amazing piece of work that's located in Peru. It is considered one of the Nazca line drawings. There are many of these in Peru that are sort of famously drawn, you know, to enormous scales. As you can see here, it tells us that the width of the image itself is 150 feet. You know, these were made roughly somewhere around 500 BCE. Oh, and before we continue any further, when we look at images and you see the term BCE, BCE means before the Common Era, and CE means the Common Era. So in this case, we believe this piece was made somewhere within a 1,000-year range of 500 BCE to 500 CE. We use BCE and CE as opposed to BC and AD in order to sort of separate, you know, our ideas of time away from one particular religion. You know, for so long we used before Christ and Anno Domini, and you know, in academia we have now changed that in order to sort of be more inclusive and to not, you know, try to center the history of Western culture in just one religion. So, but basically it's the same idea. You know, 500 BCE is the same as 500 BC. 500 CE would be the same as 500 AD, just in case you're a little confused about those kind of nomenclatures. But anyway, in this case, the Nazca line drawings, this is Spider, and this is one example of those drawings. The book even continues to tell us that it was created by scraping off dark gravel, revealing white gypsum underneath. The lines define the outline of the shape. Definition of line. Our most important kind of definition of line is a line connects two points. It can define the boundaries between planes. It defines shapes, which is another one of our visual elements. It directs the viewer's eye, which is very important. And it conveys a sense of movement and energy. This work by Giovanni Antonio Dozio called Church of Santo Spirito at Florence, this shows exactly how lines can be so important in, various ways. In this case, this is an actual sort of sketch that was used to sort of design what would eventually be the Church of Santo Spirito. And as you can see, this sort of amazing use of line to create the illusion of deep space. In this case, this is a 1-point perspective drawing. If we were to look at all of these lines, which we call converging lines, right, and we were to draw along these lines, like see how these lines go against all those tiles, the tiles here at the bottom. If we were to draw, look how they all go to one particular point. That point is on the horizon. That's the horizon line. And we call that point the vanishing point. We're going to talk in a little while a little bit more about 1-point perspective. But I just wanted you to see how, that works in this particular drawing. Our text tells us that Dozio uses line to define where the ceiling ends and the walls begin. It creates the illusion of 3 dimensions or perspective. Then those converging lines that I just drew for you help viewer to visualize the architectural space. And then this is the actual church. And so you can kind of see how the drawing itself, the design, becomes reality in this beautiful piece of architecture that is located in Florence, Italy, and was created between the years of 1436 and 1482. I don't think that probably in the history of human visual exploration can we find drawings any more beautiful than the drawings of the great Leonardo da Vinci. He kept countless sketchbooks, and each one is a revelation of visual observation and line drawing. In this case, we see drawing for a wing of a flying machine from the Codice Atlantico, folio number 858R. It is pen and ink, and in this case, it is one of many of Leonardo da Vinci's drawings in which he sort of explored the idea of how to create a flying machine. And as you can see, the use of line is very precise. It's pen and ink, so there were no, going back and erasing or trying to repair, what he had originally done. Da Vinci was, a scientist. He was not just a person that worked for the church. He worked for himself. He had many clients, not just the church. He worked for various merchants, very wealthy patrons in Florence and in Milan, and in Rome also. And so he was always doing something different, whether it be painting beautiful portraits to, these sort of ideas of these fantastic machines. He was fascinated with flight, and he also designed a lot of weaponry and for warmongers and different kind of warlords throughout, the southern part of the Mediterranean. Types and functions of line. Now, one type of line that we're going to be talking about a lot in this class is called contour line. Now, contour line is going to be different than an outline. Like if I were to talk about an outline, imagine, for example, if I were to ask you to just lay your hand down and to draw, around the edge of the hand, you would get something that looked kind of similar, to that, right? I mean, it would just be an outline of the hand. you know, as opposed to if I asked you to draw a contour, you know, I would ask you to, you know, put your hand down on the surface of your desk and sort of use your eye to sort of pinpoint a place, you know, somewhere on your hand, you know, all the wrinkle. I mean, my hand is much older probably than most of yours, so I have a lot of wrinkles. So if you found a line like in the interior of your hand, let's say like the love line, you know, if we think in those terms, you know, and you sort of then imagine that the point on your paper is where your eye is looking on the hand, and you start to slowly trace the line that you see. And I'm going down that love line, and then I go over and then up, and then I catch this one finger and I go into the interior of the finger, and then I go back up, and then I go up, and see, I'm going to go off the paper. And I'm not really looking at what I'm doing on the screen. I'm just kind of just following these lines. You know, I'm going into the interior and the exterior of the fingers. I'm looking at the interior lines, you know, like this is the thumb, you know, there's the nail, you know. I'm looking at both the lines on the interior and the exterior of the hand. You know, I'm not just looking at the outline, but the lines that make all of the different contours of the hand. It makes my hand different than every other hand. That's a contour line drawing. So that's definitely the difference between those two, outline and contour. And our book even goes on to say that lines can suggest a volume in space by providing clues about the changing character of the surface. In this work by Henry Matisse called Woman Seated in an Armchair, we can definitely see how Matisse is using line in this contour way. If we look very closely, for example, in areas such as, particularly like the dress, you can see how he's using the lines to sort of show the actual, you know, shape of the figure lying beneath the dress. By sort of curving these lines, Matisse is suggesting the curve of the thigh, you know, the curve of the breast, the belly, you know, by sort of going into the interior of the dress, he's providing a lot more information about the figure itself. This work by Pablo Picasso called Blonde Woman in Profile. Now, a profile drawing is just that, a drawing that shows basically the side of the figure, the profile of the figure. And we see again, you know, Picasso's masterful use of line. I want you to pay very direct attention. You know, for example, you know, notice how the line, you know, very carefully, meticulously follows, you know, all of the permutations, the way the line changes very slightly, to really sort of look at how this woman's face is put together. You know, he's not taking for granted that all faces are the same. He's not thinking that all faces are the same, which is a mistake that a lot of young artists make. Is they just sort of they bring, you know, they say, oh well, you know, subconsciously I know what a face looks like, and so they just start drawing without actually really without truly looking at their subject and seeing how this woman's face, this blonde woman's face, is different than every other face. You know, these little, perhaps you could even think of them as imperfections, right? But those imperfections is what makes her an individual. And great artists such as Picasso strove to great lengths to explore those elements that made this person, you know, special, specific. As we continue with the types and functions of line, I want you to think about both implied line and actual line. Now, an implied line is a line that can be implied by a series of marks, an illusion that gives the impression of line where there is no continuous mark. This chart, which is 1.1.5 in our text, is called a diagram of actual and implied lines. And it's a really great resource to sort of show you the difference between actual lines. On the left, we're seeing how, and I also want you to think about how varied lines can be, and how lines by their variation can suggest certain types of emotion, variation, texture. A line can be just a straight line between 2 points. It can be curved. It can be sort of jagged. It can follow sort of, kind of a chaotic path. It can be created of sort of a scribble effect, like going up and down, up and down, up and down very fast to sort of create this kind of, line. These are all actual lines. We can kind of see their sort of continuation from one point to another. Implied lines ask us to sort of fill in the blanks, connect the dots, literally in this case. So our eye, immediately when we see like a row, a line of dots, our eyes begin to imagine a line that connects these. And so we are creating the line, in our mind. The same with this sort of dashed line. The line that is created by the top edge of, this kind of, graph type image, even through sort of something as abstract as numbers, we can begin to say, okay, we order a line that goes from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, 6, and 7. And this sort of these telephone poles create, even though we don't see the line that connects them, we can imagine the line that runs down this sort of row of telephone poles. This artwork is the Pentateuch from Prophetical Readings. It is an example of a 13th century illustrated manuscript. And you can see that the writing is Hebrew. And what I wanted to draw your attention to is, again, the use of implied line in this image. When we look at, for example, all of the sort of beautiful, illustrations that are taking place, around the text itself, from distance, this looks like, actual line. Correct? Actual line is basically just using lines to sort of create these images. But if we look closer, you can see that the lines that we first thought were actual lines are actually comprised of text, biblical text itself. So this is actually, again, Hebrew that is being sort of, used to sort of continue the text as the illustration itself. It's really amazing. Later on in this class, we're going to look at an artist named Chris Ofili, a contemporary artist who uses this same technique in his drawings. So when you look from a distance, the drawings all appear to be made of just actual lines. But as you get closer, you realize that they are actually made of, a large number of tiny little drawings that sort of create the bigger drawing. It's really amazing, so it's so giving to the viewer because you have both near and far. I had a teacher in college that used to always say great art has great close and far. So when you're far away, it has this amazing effect, but when you're close up, it also has, merit. This is an amazing digital image from 2006 that uses this idea of implied line to really sort of draw the viewer's eyes around, almost like a roller coaster through the image. Our eyes kind of follow these dotted lines, and move around in this, kind of elliptical, circular way throughout the image. Notice how implied line is also used to create the text. In this case, "The Devil Made Me Do It," which is the title of the work itself. So, we're seeing here how, the use, when we look at the Pentateuch that we just looked at, and then we come here and see the same use of line. You can see how over a 1,000 years, thousands of years, artists are still using the same kind of techniques to do the same thing, right? To sort of enliven the image and to manipulate the audience as to how they interact with the image itself. You know, shit. And that brings us, in "The Devil Made Me Do It," definitely directional line is used to sort of direct that viewer's attention to a particular place in the artwork. Directional line is definitely a huge part of this etching by James Allen called "The Connectors." For example, you can see how these lines, like if we were to, again, look at how the lines move down these girders, right, as they go down, and see how they get closer together, right? We can imagine that if they continued and continued and continued down, they would continue getting closer and closer together until they almost disappeared into the distance. That is really to direct us, almost like an arrow. You can almost imagine that like as an arrow pointing down. It directs our eyes down, to really sort of push this idea that these two gentlemen are way up in the sky. I also want to draw your attention, and we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but this is an etching, and oftentimes in printmaking and in etching in particular, a technique called hatching is used to sort of really accentuate volume. So, for example, on this this sphere, this kind of ball, in order to sort of make it have 3 dimensions, the artist is sort of, overlapping lines to sort of create that illusion of a 3-dimensional character. That's called hatching. Hatching is basically putting different lines over each other. And the more lines you place next to each other, the darker, right? See how the more lines I sort of crisscross over and over, it gets darker, darker, darker. Whereas if I just have a few lines, it seems lighter than that. But if I add more, it doubles the darkness or the value of that sort of mass of drawings. So using hatching, we can sort of, that's a very common and the best way to use line within an etching, because basically we'll talk about printmaking later, but the lines that are etched into this image is the more lines that are there, the more ink is held. And so in that way, that part of the image becomes darker. If I were to, oh, fuck me. We can see how directional line is used to a very high degree, for example, in comics, in manga, as a way to, again, really control how the viewer's eyes move through the compositions, which are important to the narrative of the story. And in this case, the use of all of these, converging lines, to really sort of reinforce this idea of all of this sort of coming out, right, of this area. See how they all sort of point to this origin of whatever has just happened, this kind of explosion where everything is sort of coming out, and notice how, again, the use of line here, then goes toward what? The face. again, sort of accentuating what the artist is telling us is the most important aspect of this image. Lines can be so incredibly communicative of various aspects of emotion, of meaning. Communicative line, for example, vertical lines tend to communicate strength and energy. Horizontal lines can suggest calmness and passivity. Diagonal lines, right, are associated with action, motion, and change. In this chart, we can kind of see this diagram. We can see how lines can sort of convey these sort of precise ideas, right? So obviously, vertical lines, we think of something that's standing up straight, has strength, stability, and authority. If it's laying flat, that gives us the feeling that there's no motion, that it's calm, it's peaceful. And diagonal lines, the reason it suggests movement to us is if you think anytime you see something that's leaning like that, we imagine what? We imagine that it's falling or moving over. When we run, our bodies actually sort of adapt this diagonal pose, whereas our head tends to move, over, our forward foot, right? It has to do that in order so we don't topple over. Basically running is just falling, you know, and catching yourself and then falling again and catching yourself over and over again in a particular direction, right? So we know subconsciously from nature that anytime we see something that's leaning like that because we understand, at our most base level, the idea of gravity, well, that object obviously is falling. So if an artist uses a diagonal line in a painting or a drawing, our eyes and our mind immediately tell us, oh, well, motion is happening. We're catching this moment before this object tends to fall forward or fall over. And so using diagonal lines can create a lot of sort of drama within the image itself. This is The Bedroom by Vincent van Gogh. This is an image that he painted of his actual room. And, notice how he uses so many diagonal lines in this image. And the reason this is important, you see how all of these sort of diagonal lines sort of happen. They're not going to horizon because it's really flattened out. It's not like these lines all go to one point, right? That's not what he's trying to convey here. Van Gogh was a very troubled individual. Had a lot of problems with socialization and sort of dealing with big crowds of people. And this shows how even when he's alone in his room, he's still feeling that the world is this kind of crazy, chaotic place where everything is about to fall over. So, he is using this idea of diagonal line conveying motion, or in this case, chaos, is really giving us a view into his, the inner workings of Van Gogh's mind. That even when he's alone in his room, away from all people, he does not feel safe. And that's really how these lines are being used to sort of suggest this idea. Our text goes on to even say that most lines are very strong verticals, suggesting it's not calm, and that unease is also communicated through the emphatic diagonals and changes in color and value. Definitely Van Gogh's use of color, they're beautiful, but the colors are always very jarring, which again really drives home this idea of mental unrest. The next visual element that we're going to talk about is shape. And essentially, shape is a two-dimensional area, the boundaries of which are defined by lines, again, lines, or suggested by changes in color or value. In this case, we see a shape defined, by a line, right? And then next to it, we can see that this is a shape that's defined simply by this sort of, uh, uh, color of gray, right? That separates it from the color of white around it. There's no, the line is actually created just by the boundary between those two colors, the gray and the white. And then here we have something that becomes very spherical because you have a value change. Value is this movement from light to dark, right? And so you have a very light area that gradually becomes darker as it moves to this edge of the shape, which creates this illusion of the three-dimensional character of a sphere. So you can see how very, line and value and color can be used to sort of create shape. Shapes come in many different categories. Geometric and organic shapes. Geometric shapes, for example, here we see the square, the circle, and the triangle, are very much kind of these mathematical uh, uh, shapes that we don't typically see. If we see these in our world, they are usually human made, human created. They don't appear naturally in the world. If you go in the forest, you're really, I mean, even if it might look at first glance, a limb of a tree might look straight and might look like a straight line. If you really were to look very, very carefully at it, there are no perfectly straight lines in nature. In nature, we are surrounded by organic shapes. For example, these that you see here. Most things we see in nature all have sort of the nature of a contour line, right? There are no perfectly straight, lines in nature. That only, truly straight lines only happen in objects that we make. This is an example of how, geometric lines can be used, for example, in architecture. We find them oftentimes in architecture because, it's that sort of ordering of the universe outside of nature. And also because, or geometric shapes tend to have a large level of stability, right? You don't necessarily want everything to be curved because what did we talk about diagonal lines? That tends to fall over. And that's the last thing you want in a house, right? So we tend to always have these sort of very square geometric shapes in our structures. Now, as time has gone on and through the use of AI, through the use of computers, we can design much more sort of organic shapes that still have strength, can still stand up to gravity. But for many, many thousands of years, sort of these straight lines or geometric shapes were what were sought after in building. This work by Miriam Shapiro called Baby Blocks shows how you can create a very dynamic image by sort of contrasting organic and geometric shapes together in the same image. You have this sort of geometric pattern in the background, right? You see this in the background. And then you have these, even these sort of organic shapes, these flowers that contrast against those and really make them sort of pop forward. So that kind of use of those two different elements together creates a much more interesting image. Just like with line, where we have actual line and implied line, remember we talked about that. For example, the actual line would be a line like that, an implied line would be sort of a dotted line, right? Where our eyes have to sort of connect the dots. We can see the same thing with a shape. You can have implied shape and you can have actual shape. An actual shape, for example, would be like a triangle, right? That's an actual shape. Here we see a triangle that's created by a series of these, these lines, basically, one on top of the other, shorter and sort of in a wedge, right? And so our eye connects the dots and creates in our head a triangle. Again, we sort of connect these dots to create, this sort of, figure eight kind of figure, and even this, we begin to sort of create a pentagon by sort of connecting the dots. So these are implied shapes, which again can be used by artists to sort of create various effects in two-dimensional images. Now, as we saw in the painting just moments ago, this idea of using, geometric shapes and organic shapes together, this is an idea of contrast. And contrast is when an artist uses two noticeably different states of an element. Uh, and he or she is then applying this sort of principle of contrast. Examples would include regular and irregular lines next to each other in an image, geometric and organic shapes, as we just saw. And then also, an artist might use positive and negative shapes. A positive shape is defined by its surrounding empty space, which is the negative space. In visual form, positive and negative are often represented by black and white, but any color combination can work in this idea of positive and negative shape. Here, this is a very well-known campaign poster from 1996 by Shepard Fairey called Obey. And you can see this sort of stark use of black and white and red to create that contrast, right? That contrast between light and dark, which again is an interesting use. If you think about it metaphorically, when we're talking about campaigns, we often have one side against another. So by using sort of this contrast between black and white, the white and the red, is definitely talking about what this represents, right? It's a campaign, trying to sort of represent, two different sides. And Fairey has done many of these. In fact, you probably couldn't walk through the streets of Houston even today without finding this image somewhere like on a telephone pole or on the side of a building, because it has been largely taken up by people who feel uh, an urgent need to rebel against authority, right? The idea that the authority tends to be very black and white. We think of it in that way, that authority tries to suggest that either you're with us or you're against us, right? You're either one or a zero. And, Fairey really pushed this idea in this campaign poster called Obey. You can actually see in this image from 1996 as they were being installed in public. And you can see how Obey Giant, the word giant was used in some of them. They would sort of change the text up, again, to really push this idea of cultural normalcy and cultural subservience. It feels very 1984, an authoritarian kind of attempt to sort of, control the minds, right, of all people who view them. Our text goes on to tell us that Fairey's use of interlocking positive and negative shapes can create that strong visual impact, and that as a street artist, he needs to catch his audience's attention quickly as they pass by. Again, using that sort of that starkness of the black and white catches the eye very quickly. On a side note, the image that he used is based on the professional wrestler from the 80s, Andre the Giant. So you can, if you're familiar with that period of time in wrestling, you can totally see Andre the Giant's face in the poster. This work is by Georgia O'Keeffe called Music, Pink and Blue 2. And again, you can see how O'Keeffe has taken a lot of liberty as far as like her color palette when she works on these different images. These are not colors that you would naturally see in the world. but that's not what the work is about. The work is about how she has sort of found in the natural world examples of these beautiful contrasts between light and dark, and the sensuousness of organic line and shape in the images themselves. It is an oil on canvas from 1919, and as we continue, our text will tell us that O'Keeffe's abstract shapes derive from that close observation, and that the emphasis on the negative blue shape in the bottom right of the picture really does sort of, help pull our eyes into the composition, which is then, taken on this amazing sort of trip up through the upper left-hand quadrant of the image itself to that beautiful line work that you see with these sort of lavender colors in the top. And, it's a masterful use of color and line to sort of give the viewer sort of an interesting experience with the work itself. This artwork, it is a digital image by Noma Barr called Gun Crime. And it is an absolutely perfect illustration of this idea of positive and negative shape, right? Positive and negative. And the way that can be used subtly as a way to sort of really push an idea. In this case, you see that the positive shape is this sort of black area which creates that silhouette of the gun. But then the negative space, which is this sort of, beige area around the gun, then becomes the face of a person who's dying. So, you have that sort of contrast of positive and negative, and then the metaphorical idea of positive and negative. What is positive, but what is negative about the image, right? Is the death that comes about because of the gun, which is So, again, Barr's taking a very simple idea from visual elements, right, and principles of design, and using it to create a much richer narrative about gun use and gun violence. Now, this is, I'm sure most of you have seen a lot of M.C. Escher's work. My God, they've been reproduced on countless numbers of T-shirts, mugs, posters. In the 70s and 80s, you couldn't walk into a head shop without seeing an M.C. Escher on the wall somewhere. Between Escher and Salvador Dali, it's a whole generation of people who sort of tripped out as they looked at these images. This is called Sky and Water from 1938. It's a woodcut. We'll get more into woodcuts and printmaking techniques later on in the class. But you can see how that use of positive and negative space, the use of value change, the use of line, kind of all culminates in Escher's work. And in this case, as we move down the image, as we move from the top and our eyes scroll down the image, how these positive, it begins with these sort of positive shapes of the birds that slowly morph. You can actually see it beginning right here into the shape of these fish. So you have, our eye sort of sees this as this, metamorphosis from bird to fish, or if we go up from fish to bird. So, Escher is using, this visual language, not just to create an interesting image, but to talk about, how our mind works, how we tend to see shapes and then subconsciously they evolve in our heads into something else. It's kind of like there was a corner in the room of my grandmother's house, and that was where, when I got into trouble, she had this little stool and she would make me sit in that corner, and I'd have to stay. She had, many of you maybe have grandparents that have this, you don't see it too much anymore, but had like a wood grain panel, right, on the walls. And I would have to sit there and just stare at this wood grain, for 30 or 40 minutes, however long she would make me sit there. And you would start to see faces, right, in the wood grain. And then every time you go back and you sit in that stool and you look again at that wall, the first thing you see is that same face. It's like you can't unsee it after you see it. And Escher and most artists are very aware of the fact that we as human beings, the way our eyes work, the way our minds work, is we tend to look for pattern. And once we find pattern, we don't unsee it. And, works such as this, Sky and Water, and many of his other works really do push the boundaries of how our eyes see things and then don't unsee them. And, again, Escher is a master at this, and that's why his images have held up for so long. And that sort of ends our first lecture on line and shape. And again, if you have any questions about this lecture, you can submit them to me at cakers@lee.edu, and I will answer you in an expeditious fashion. Thank you.